On the coldest night Cleveland had seen in a decade, a 9-year-old engineer was making coffee inside a steel shipping container she built for $300. Outside, the temperature was -11. Inside, it was 57 degrees. 3 miles away, the city's emergency shelters had turned people away at the door. If you want to know exactly how she did it and what happened next, subscribe and keep watching. She was making coffee. That was the first thing you noticed. Not the frost on the window, not the industrial skyline barely visible through the pre-dawn dark, but the small aluminum pot balanced over a ceramic tile. The smell of cheap grounds blooming into something almost domestic. Maya Chen was 29 years old, and she was making coffee the way she did every morning. Deliberately, quietly, like it was the only thing in the world that needed doing right now. She poured it into a cracked Ohio State mug she'd carried in her backpack for 2 years, wrapped both hands around it, and felt the warmth travel up through her palms and into the place behind her sternum where cold tends to settle the longest. Then she picked up her phone from the sleeping bag beside her and checked the temperature. Outside, -11 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, where she was sitting, 57 degrees. She looked at the $4 thermometer, taped to the insulated wall above her, the one she'd bought at a Dollar Tree on Lorraine Avenue 3 months ago. And for a moment, she just studied the number the way an engineer studies a data point, not with relief, not with pride, but with the quiet satisfaction of a system behaving exactly as it was designed to. It was not the average. It was the ceiling. The number the system could reach on a still night with fresh candles and new seals on every seam, and she knew it would be lower on a windy night or a longer one. But it was real, and it was hers, and she wrote it down. 68 degrees of separation between her body and the Cleveland winter, maintained overnight by 4 tea candles, a stack of terracotta pots, and physics. She scrolled her phone. The Cleveland Winter Emergency Shelter had posted at 1:47 inches the morning. At 118% capacity. Cannot accept new arrivals tonight. Please contact 211 for alternative resources. Maya read it twice. She put the phone face down on her knee, took a long sip of coffee, and looked up at the ceiling of quilted moving blankets she had stapled there herself in October, their faded colors, dusty blue, brown, a green that might once have been bright, absorbing the candlelight into something that almost resembled warmth you could see. Outside, somewhere 2 blocks east, a fire truck moved slow through the ice-locked streets, its lights pulsing red against the container's one small window without sound, like a heartbeat the city was barely keeping. Maya watched it pass. She opened her composition notebook, a spiral-bound one she'd found with 30 blank pages left, in a donation bin outside a church on West 25th, and wrote the date, the inside temperature, the outside temperature, and the differential. 68 degrees. She underlined it. Then she wrote one more line beneath the data, something she hadn't planned to write, something that came out the way true things sometimes do when you've been alone and awake in the dark long enough to stop filtering yourself. They were full again. We were not. She closed the notebook, she finished the coffee. The city outside was doing the best it could, so was she. There is a specific kind of grief that comes not from losing something suddenly, but from watching it go piece by piece over 18 months, each loss small enough to rationalize. Until one morning, you are standing outside a building with a backpack and an engineering toolkit and nowhere particular to be. Maya Chen had experienced that grief so thoroughly by the time she arrived in Cleveland that she had stopped calling it grief and started calling it data. It was easier that way. She had studied mechanical engineering at Ohio State on a partial scholarship and 2 part-time jobs, graduated with honors and $89,000 in student debt, and taken a position at a clean energy startup in Columbus called Verdant Systems that paid $72,000 a year and made her feel, for the first time in her life, like the work she was doing matched the person she understood herself to be. She spent 4 years there. She designed thermal regulation systems for modular solar installations. She was good at it, genuinely, measurably good. And she knew it not from arrogance, but from the specific confidence that comes from solving hard problems correctly, repeatedly, under pressure. Then the CEO of Verdant Systems was investigated for securities fraud in the spring of 2022. And within 6 weeks, the company's primary investors had withdrawn, the office had been quietly emptied, and Maya had received a severance email on a Tuesday afternoon while eating lunch at her desk. She lost her health insurance on the 1st of the following month. In the 3rd week of that month, a physician at an urgent care clinic found an enlarged nodule on her thyroid, and referred her for further testing. The testing, the ultrasound, the biopsy, the follow-up, all of it without insurance, cost $4,200 over 11 weeks. It was benign. The financial damage was not. Her savings lasted 4 months. She moved to Cleveland because her Aunt Patrice lived there, the one person in her family who had always kept an extra key on the hook beside the door without being asked. But Aunt Patrice died of a stroke in November 2022, quickly and without warning, and the house passed to her son Marcus, who was not unkind, but who had his own family and his own mortgage, and who called Maya on a Thursday evening to say, gently, that he didn't think the arrangement could continue past the end of the month. Maya said she understood. She did. She packed her backpack, clothes, the Ohio State mug, her composition notebook, and the toolkit, and she walked out into a Cleveland December with $300 in her checking account and a mechanical engineer's mind that had not stopped working even once through all of it, cataloging, analyzing, refusing to stop asking what can be done with what is here. Most people experiencing homelessness spend their first weeks in a state that social workers describe as crisis orientation, the nervous system locked into immediate survival, unable to plan beyond the next meal or the next warm space. Maya Chen spent her first weeks in Cleveland making a table. Not a physical table, a decision matrix, written in the back of her composition notebook in pencil, with columns for feasibility, thermal performance, legal exposure, and material cost. She had identified 4 possible shelter approaches and was evaluating them the way she would evaluate competing design solutions at Verdant Systems, without attachment to any particular answer, and without the luxury of being wrong. Tents failed on thermal performance. A nylon shell provided almost no insulation value against a Cleveland winter, and the legal exposure in public parks was high. Abandoned buildings offered more thermal mass, but scored dangerously on structural safety and police contact probability. A storage unit was thermally controllable, but cost a monthly fee she couldn't sustain. Shipping containers scored highest on every axis. Structural integrity, insulation potential, legal ambiguity on foreclosed land, and, most importantly, the possibility of acquiring one for nothing, if she understood the economics of the people who owned damaged ones. She had been walking past the Cuyahoga Freight Yard on her way to the Cleveland Public Library branch on Lorraine Avenue every morning for 11 days when it rained on a Wednesday in late January. She ducked under the overhang of the freight yard's small office building and stood there watching water run off the stacked containers in the lot, the damaged ones pushed to the back like embarrassing relatives at a family photo. A man in his late 60s opened the office door, Frank, though she didn't know his name yet, and looked at her with the specific expression of someone deciding whether to say something or not. He said, "You want to come in out of the rain?" She said, "I'm fine, thank you." A silence. Then she said, almost to herself, looking at the back of the lot, "That 20-foot unit with the longitudinal crease on the south wall. How long has it been sitting?" Frank stopped holding the door halfway. 8 months, he said. "You know what a longitudinal crease means for stack certification?" Maya looked at him directly for the first time. "It means you're paying storage tax on a unit that can't generate revenue." Frank studied her face for a moment, with the careful attention of a man who has been surprised before and learned to pay attention when it happens. "Come in out of the rain," he said again. This time she did. Frank's office smelled like burnt coffee and old paper. There was a Cleveland Browns calendar on the wall from 2021 that nobody had taken down. Maya registered it and moved on. She sat in the chair across from his desk and she told him, without preamble, what she wanted and what she was offering in return. She wanted the 20-foot unit with a longitudinal crease and the damaged corner post. She was offering a written structural assessment of every damaged unit in his lot, a formal engineering evaluation, documented with photographs and technical notation that he could submit to his insurance carrier and use for tax depreciation filings. She had done this kind of documentation at Verdant Systems. She knew exactly what it needed to look like to be useful to an accountant or an insurance adjuster. Frank leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and Maya watched him and said nothing, because she had learned in 4 years of working in rooms with investors and contractors that the most important thing you can do after making a clear offer is to let the silence sit. He said, "You're an engineer?" She said, "I was." He said, "What happened?" She told him the short version. Startup collapse, health crisis, the math that followed, and she told it the way she told it to herself, which was the way an engineer files an incident report: sequence, cause, consequence. When she finished, Frank was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I've had probably 6 or 8 people come in here and ask me about that unit in the last year. Most of them said they'd owe me a favor. One guy offered me $20. He paused. "You came in here with a trade," Maya said. "A favor is a liability. A trade is a transaction. Transactions are cleaner." Frank almost smiled. He told her he'd need 2 weeks to think about it. She said that was fine. She came back in 4 days with a sample page from the structural assessment: 1 unit, full documentation, photographs taken on her phone, formatted in a table she had typed at the library, and printed for 15 cents. Frank looked at it for a long time. Then he looked up and said, "When do you want the container moved?" Transportation cost her $210. She had arranged it with a tiltbed freight carrier making a delivery 2 blocks from the Lorraine Avenue lot. The driver could hydraulic lower the container directly onto the concrete without additional equipment, negotiating a courtesy drop that cost her most of her remaining cash and left her with $90 and a container on a patch of foreclosed concrete, Frank had said, as she was leaving. "I've been trying to get rid of that unit for 8 months. You're the first person who made it worth my while to help you." Maya thanked him. Walking back to the library in the cold, she thought about that. Not with satisfaction exactly, but with something cleaner. The knowledge that the trade had been fair. She hadn't asked for charity. She hadn't needed to. The container arrived on a flatbed on a gray Tuesday morning in early February, and when the driver set it down on the old commercial concrete of the Lorraine Avenue lot and drove away, Maya stood in front of it with $90 in her account and a list of systems in her head and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not hope exactly, which she had learned to be careful with, but its more reliable cousin: traction. The sense that the problem and the tools were finally in the same place. She had already been pulling materials for 3 weeks. A construction crew renovating a former bank branch 2 blocks east had been generating rigid foam insulation offcuts every afternoon, long, jagged strips, some of them 2 feet wide, stacked beside the dumpster before they went in. Maya had taken roughly 180 square feet of it, piece by piece, storing it under a tarp in the lot before the container arrived. She began with the walls. Steel shipping containers are thermal disasters in their unmodified state. The metal conducts cold inward with brutal efficiency, and sleeping in a bare container in January is functionally the same as sleeping on the sidewalk. Insulation was not optional. It was the entire project. She cut each foam piece to fit the spaces between the container's internal structural ribs, glued them in place with construction adhesive she bought for $11 at a hardware store on Lorraine, and pressed each piece firmly until the tack grabbed. 4 days of work. But she knew, because thermodynamics does not make exceptions for effort, that the foam alone would fail. The structural ribs themselves were the problem. Uninterrupted steel pathways running floor to ceiling, conducting cold directly from the outside surface to the interior air, regardless of how perfectly the spaces between them were filled. She understood thermal bridging not as a concept but as a physical reality she could feel through a wall. From a donation pile outside a theater company on Detroit Avenue, she pulled a dozen heavy quilted moving blankets, the thick ones, faded colors, the kind that wrap furniture in storage, and she hung them across the interior walls, covering every rib so that no uninsulated steel surface remained exposed to the air she would be breathing. That second layer was the difference between surviving and building something that worked. Derek appeared on the 3rd day. He hadn't introduced himself yet. He just materialized each morning at a distance, watching with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who had seen a lot of projects start and not many finish. On the morning she was wrestling the roof gutter into place, a strip of aluminum flashing she had bent into shape with her hands and a piece of rebar, he walked across the lot without a word, took the other end of the flashing, and held it steady while she fastened it. When it was done, he stepped back and looked at it and said, "That'll hold." Maya said, "I know." He nodded. He came back the next morning and the morning after that. By the end of the 3rd week, the container's interior looked like something between an engineering prototype and a very organized nest. Every steel surface covered, every seam sealed with 4mm polyethylene sheeting that Maya had bought for $20 at a hardware store and stretched tight across the ceiling and walls like a second skin over the moving blankets, holding the warm air in and the moisture out. The floor got foam offcuts first, then blankets, then a sheet of plywood she had found at a demolition site on West 58th, cut to fit with Derek's circular saw and carried back in sections. The space had stopped feeling like a steel box and started feeling like a space. Bounded, insulated, hers. The heating system cost nothing. Maya had found 2 cracked terracotta pots behind a garden supply store on Fulton Road that was throwing out damaged inventory, and she had taken both of them and stacked them inverted. The smaller nested inside the larger, on a stand she had welded from rebar scraps, using a borrowed MIG welder at an auto body shop whose owner recognized her from the freight yard neighborhood. 4 tea candles on a ceramic tile underneath. The stacked pots created a thermal mass amplifier, more surface area than a single pot, absorbing the candle heat into the dense clay and releasing it slowly at around 230 degrees Fahrenheit, radiating gentle infrared warmth across the insulated space for 4 hours on a single set of candles. The ventilation was 2 4-inch holes cut through the container wall, with a hole saw borrowed from the same auto body shop, one high on the east wall, one low on the west wall, both covered with screen door mesh salvaged from a renovation dumpster. Each hole had a wooden plug she had cut from scrap lumber and sanded smooth enough to seal flush against the mesh frame. Not airtight, but close enough to reduce the convection rate on nights when the differential was extreme. And she could open them by degrees, the way you tune a damper. Warm air exits high. Pressure drop pulls fresh air in low. Continuous passive convection. No moving parts, no electricity, no noise. Maya had calculated the vent sizing in her notebook in about 3 minutes. Cubic footage of the container, BTU output of the stack pot heater, required air exchange rate for carbon dioxide management at single occupancy, and she had built exactly what the math said to build, because overventing would drain the heat and underventing would make the air dangerous, and there was no margin in this project for approximation. The electrical system totaled $18. A 50-watt solar panel pulled from a scrapped RV at a salvage yard on Memphis Avenue. The owner, an older man named Gus, who had initially tried to sell her a $180 inverter system she didn't need, ultimately sold it to her for $10 and threw in a charge controller for free. After she showed him the hand-drawn circuit diagram in her notebook and explained, patiently and without condescension, why 1-2-volt direct current end-to-end was more efficient than converting to AC. The car battery cost $8 from the same yard. Gus let her use a load tester on it before she left. It was reading about 60% of its rated capacity, which was enough for her load calculation at single occupancy draw, and she logged it in her notebook as a component with a known degradation curve rather than a reliable baseline. LED strip lights donated by a Pentecostal church on West 25th, plugged directly into a cigarette lighter outlet. Phone charging via USB adapter. Water came from the roof. A 5.5-gallon food-grade drum from a bakery on Lorraine caught the runoff from the rain gutter Derek had helped her install. Drinking water was 1 gallon per week from the gas station on West 25th. The composting toilet was a 5-gallon bucket, a $5 toilet seat from Habitat for Humanity Restore, and a bag of sawdust from a woodworking shop on the east side. Total cash spent, $300. Total systems functional, 4. She'd been tracking weather patterns for 2 weeks before the cold snap arrived, watching the forecast tighten each day the way you watch a system approach on radar. Not with dread, but with the focused attention of someone who has made a bet and needs to know if the math holds. By January 13th, 2024, the National Weather Service was forecasting an overnight low of -11 degrees for the Cleveland metro area, with sustained wind chills reaching -22. Maya went through her checklist that afternoon with the methodical calm she had learned to cultivate the way other people learn to cultivate patience or faith, not because she felt calm, but because the work required it. And the work was what she had. Fresh candles. Polyethylene seams checked and retaped where the cold had stressed them. Vent mesh clear of debris. Water drum moved inside the container against the east wall for the duration of the cold snap. Insulated, with a wrap of moving blanket, with 2 inches of rigid foam cut to fit the lid. It took up floor space she didn't have much of. But a frozen drum was a useless drum, and she had made the trade in her notebook 2 days before the temperature dropped. Sleeping bag unrolled and positioned close to the heater stand. Not too close. Notebook on the sleeping bag with the thermometer readings already logged for 6 p.m. and 9 p.m. She lit the candles at 10 o'clock, set the second set ready for 2 in the morning, and got into the sleeping bag fully dressed. At 2:15 she heard knocking. Not frantic knocking, slow, tired knocking, the kind that comes from hands that have been cold for a long time and don't have much force left in them. She opened the container door and found Walter and Louise Briggs standing in the dark, a couple in their late 60s, him in a Carhartt jacket that was doing its best, her with a wool hat pulled down to her eyebrows and both hands pressed together under her chin. They lived in a Ford Econoline van parked 3 blocks east. The van's engine had seized in the cold around midnight. They had walked toward the light from her container window. Maya looked at them for a moment, the exhaustion in Walter's eyes, the particular stillness in Louise's face that comes from cold, that has moved past discomfort into something more serious, and she stepped back from the door and said, "Come in." The interior temperature climbed from 57 to 61 degrees, within 40 minutes of having 2 more bodies in the space. Maya noted it in her composition notebook. And then she said to Walter, who was watching her write, "You're not a burden. You're a BTU source." Walter looked at her. A small surprise sound came from somewhere in his chest. Not quite a laugh, but close. The sound of someone who has not been spoken to like a useful person in a while and doesn't know quite what to do with it. Louise reached across and put her hand on Maya's arm and didn't say anything. The thermometer read 61 degrees at 3 a.m. Outside, it was -11. The system held. Officer Brenda Walsh arrived on a Wednesday morning in mid-March in a city vehicle with the seal of the Cleveland Department of Building and Housing on the door, and she came carrying a removal notice with a 4 8-hour compliance window, which was not the standard 30-day notice for unpermitted structures, but rather the accelerated version that the department issued when a third party had a documented interest in the property. Maya was sitting outside the container on an overturned milk crate, reading a library book about passive solar design, when the city vehicle pulled into the lot, and she watched Brenda get out and walk toward her with the clipboard and the particular set of the shoulders that people carry when they have been sent to do something they expect to be unpleasant. Brenda was in her mid-40s, black, with close-cropped natural hair and wire-framed glasses, and she read Maya the notice with professional neutrality and then said, "Do you understand what this means?" Maya said, "It means someone with money wants this lot." Brenda's expression shifted by about 3 degrees. Not much, but Maya was good at reading small adjustments in people's faces, and she noted it the way she noted everything. She said, "Can I show you something first?" She brought Brenda inside. The interior was clean and tight. The moving blankets even across the walls, the polyethylene vapor barrier unmarked, the terracotta heater system sitting on its stand with a ceramic tile beneath it like a small altar to applied physics. But what stopped Brenda was the notebook. Maya opened it on the sleeping bag. 90 days of temperature logs. Inside and outside readings every 6 hours, vent performance notes, heater efficiency calculations, material cost documentation, and she said, "This is an engineering field study. If you demolish it, you're destroying data that no university in this city has collected." Brenda looked at the notebook for a long time. Then she looked up and said quietly, "Where did you go to school?" Maya said, "Ohio State. Mechanical engineering." Brenda was still for a moment. Then, "I went to Ohio State too. Social work." She paused. "I wrote my thesis on urban displacement and municipal response systems." They looked at each other across the small insulated space. Maya said nothing. Brenda closed her own clipboard. She sat down on the edge of the sleeping bag, not with authority, not with performance, but with the simple human fatigue of someone who has been carrying an assumption for a long time and just set it down. "I came here to do a job," she said eventually. "Tell me how the vent system works." Maya told her. All of it. Brenda listened for 40 minutes. Then she stood up and said she was going to log the visit as an inspection with findings pending, which was a real category in the department's system and which bought time, not unlimited time, but time. While she drafted a formal request to her supervisor for a 30-day administrative review on the grounds that the structure presented ambiguous jurisdictional status. It was not the same as not filing. It was filing something different and doing it carefully, and she knew the difference. By the fall of 2024, there were 4 containers on the lot at Lorraine Avenue, and the lot had acquired the quiet, functional character of a place where people have decided, collectively and without announcement, to take care of each other. Derek's container went up in March 2024, 2 weeks after the night Walter and Louise had knocked on Maya's door. He had watched the build closely enough that he needed less instruction than guidance, and Maya spent 3 evenings walking him through the vent sizing math and the thermal bridge problem, and Derek, who had been a heavy equipment mechanic in the Army for 8 years and understood systems the way people understand languages they grew up speaking, absorbed it, and adapted it, and added a detail she hadn't thought of. A small shelf welded inside the container at sleeping bag height, giving the heater unit better thermal distribution across the lower half of the space where a body actually was. Maya wrote the modification into her notebook with a small notation. D. Improvement. March 14. Walter and Louise's container was the third. They had nowhere else to go, and Maya and Derek helped them build it through April, teaching as they went, Louise turning out to have a precise and unhurried hand with the foam cutting that neither Maya nor Derek could match. The fourth container belonged to Nora Vasquez, a 38-year-old former elementary school teacher who had lost her position when the private school, where she taught, closed without warning in August. Nora arrived at the lot with 2 rolling suitcases and a third-grade classroom's worth of composure, the practiced steadiness of someone who has spent years being the calm person in a room full of frightened children and has internalized it so thoroughly she could no longer turn it off. She cried once briefly on the first day while Derek was explaining the vent holes. Then she put on work gloves and asked what needed cutting. The developer's lawyers arrived in October. Maya had known they were coming. Brenda Walsh had called her personal cell phone, which was not a thing officers officially did, to let her know that a purchase motion on the foreclosure had been filed. The legal notice arrived on a Thursday, 72 hours to vacate. Maya walked to the Cleveland Public Library, photocopied every page of the removal notice and the 90-day engineering notebook, and spent 4 hours at a computer drafting a summary document. On Friday morning, she walked into the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland and handed the packet to the intake coordinator without an appointment. A staff attorney named Carmen Rodriguez looked at the packet, looked at Maya, and said, "This thermal data, did you generate this yourself?" Maya said yes. Carmen said, "Okay, I think we can argue this. The argument that the Lorraine Avenue containers constituted a legitimate engineering study conducted on public foreclosure land with no active owner of record bought them 6 more months. It was not a solution. It was time. On the lot, they called it. What it was. Time." The email from Professor David Okafor at Cleveland State University arrived on a Tuesday in November 2024, and Maya read it 3 times on her phone, sitting outside the container in 40-degree air with a cup of coffee, reading it the way she had learned to read things that might change something, carefully, without rushing toward the conclusion, making sure she understood what was actually being said before she decided how to feel about it. He had heard about the Lorraine Avenue container project through Carmen Rodriguez at Legal Aid, who had mentioned it to a colleague who taught in the CSU engineering department, and he was writing to ask whether Maya would be willing to present her thermal shelter design at an applied engineering seminar in January. He described it as an opportunity to share findings with graduate and undergraduate students working in sustainable design. He offered an $800 honorarium. Maya sat with that number for a moment. $800 was not a rescue. It was groceries and 2 months of water gallons and a new composition notebook and a bus pass and a little left over. But it was also the first time in 2 years that someone had offered to pay her for knowing what she knew. And that distinction between charity and transaction, between being helped and being valued, landed somewhere specific and real inside her chest, in the same place the cold had lived all winter. She said yes. The seminar was held in a lecture room on the 4th floor of the CSU engineering building on a January morning, and Maya stood at the front of it in clean jeans and a gray sweater from Goodwill and a pair of boots that Derek had found at a donation center on West 25th and cleaned with a rag, before setting outside her container door without comment. She had no PowerPoint presentation. She had her composition notebook open to the first page of temperature logs and a sheet of foam board on which she had drawn, by hand, the full system diagram, the thermal layers, the convection loop, the solar circuit, the water collection schematic, in the same clear technical notation she had used at Verdant Systems, because the work was the work regardless of the context it lived in. A student in the 3rd row, a junior named Tyler with an Ohio State sweatshirt and the slightly defensive posture of someone smart enough to know he doesn't know everything, raised his hand near the end and asked, "Where did you study thermodynamics?" Maya looked at him for a moment. She said, "Ohio State, and then a freight lot on the west side of Cleveland." The room was quiet in the specific way. Rooms get quiet when something true has been said that nobody was entirely prepared for. Brenda Walsh was sitting in the back row. She had come on her own time, in her own clothes, because Maya had sent her the seminar information in a text message that said only, "You said you wanted to understand the vent system. This is better." After the seminar, Brenda found Maya in the hallway and said, "I came to that lot in March to do a job. I've been thinking about that day since." Maya said, "I know. I assumed things," Brenda said. "About who you were. Before I talked to you." Maya nodded slowly. "Most people do," she said. "That's not the same as it being okay, but it's the beginning of the difference." Maya was still living on Lorraine Avenue at the time this story was written. The legal motion was still pending. The lot still had no address, no utility bills, and no vacancies. Derek lived next door. Walter and Louise were 2 containers down. Nora had started tutoring neighborhood kids in her container on Saturday mornings. The door propped open, voices carrying across the concrete in the cold. The $300 had not bought Maya Chen a home. It had bought her a system. And the system had held through 2 Cleveland winters. And the system had grown into a community, and the community had produced knowledge. And the knowledge had found its way into a lecture hall, and the lecture hall had sent it back out into the world with the names of 4 people who had built something real from what others had thrown away. What Maya built was not a container shelter. What she built was a demonstration that expertise does not live only in buildings with nameplates on the door, that dignity is not a resource that runs out when money does, that the constraint you cannot fight is the one you design around, and that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is sit down in a room where they are not expected and explain clearly and without apology exactly how the heat works. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. The next one is already waiting. Drop a comment telling me which part hit hardest, and let me know what city you're watching from.